Maybe you could direct me a little bit more to where you would like me to go with this, because that's a big, big story.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of, moments that it seems for me quite pivotal. One um, is, you going to play with friends over
Yeah.
a house and, kind of the culture shock of, the food they ate, right? But, sitting around eating, what was it, like a mozzarella and pesto sandwich, and you're just like,
Yes.
what the hell is this? But like, this kind of hidden contempt
Yes.
um that existed because your parents had integrated this neighborhood, and the ways in which neighbors used you as proxy for their aggression that they couldn't quite maybe get to your parents at, right? So, you're at a lunch table at your friend's house, and the neighbor asks you a question between cigarette puffs, right?
Yes.
How does it feel to be a Negro?
Yes. Yes.
Something like this. How are how were you processing that as a child, and how, kind of looking back, do you see it's created the work you're doing now?
I'm not sure that I was processing it, very well. What I think I was
Mm-hmm.
doing, and let me just, I'll say something. What I'm trying to get to the end of was that by the end of sixth grade in
Mm-hmm.
1960, the sixth grade was the school year 67, 68. And that's when I did start to process it, but only because of the outside world. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
I think that in those days, you would imagine that you live in a house. It's a very big house, but it's a very black house internally. And then you go into the street, and there are all these other big mansions, but they're all very white
Mm-hmm.
internally. And so there were a lot of conversations that were happening in my house that were not happening anywhere else.
Mm.
The murder of Medgar Evers, for example, Fannie Lou Hamer in the Democratic Convention, um, the murder of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. These were kinds of things that as the oldest child, I would watch the expression and the quiet talk on my parents' face, or the rage, but they didn't want me to be a racial being. I
Mm-hmm.
is my sense. So I was picking up these things from them, and then of course my mother. People not speaking to her for years because she stayed home. My dad drove 5 miles away to the university every day, but she stayed home from 62 to about 68 before she went back to finish her PhD. And those are the years in which the neighbors basically would not speak to her. Um, so I wasn't doing a lot of processing, but what I why I'm stammering is because what I know about that, I know in through hindsight and looking back. And you're asking
Mm-hmm.
me, what did I know about that then? And
Mm.
and what I knew about that then was a lot of uptightness inside the house and a lot of smiling performativity to the neighbors once you stepped out the door.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What I noticed then was that when we moved from Michigan, my dad got his PhD in '62, and we tried to get a place. He would come back every day. We were subletting from a white professor's house in another part of the city, and having gone out to say that he's secured an apartment, then he'd come back to say he had not secured an apartment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I'll be like, well, what's going on here? This is just like, of course, you and I now know what's going on,
Mm-hmm.
but I wouldn't understand how could they tell you on the phone and then you come back to the crib and we don't have a place to go to? Are we going to be at this guy's house for the rest of our lives? Um, and we finally got the place in Kenwood. That was a big scandal. Um,
Mm.
the CBS affiliate did a show to say that we were blockbusting. They had to pay a huge amount of money. The banks wouldn't lend us money. There was just to the owner, who said, I can never come back to this neighborhood. So I wasn't processing everything until 68. And my entire life changed in 68 because something happened, as you saw in the book, with the death of King and the rebellions in the world. And I thought, that means something to me. That means something to me. And at the end of sixth grade, this would be like the last couple of weeks in April of 1968. Another Black bourgeois person who was friends with my dad was asked by my school to come and talk to the kids about what's going on. Now I thought, oh, this dude, because I knew John Murray. You know, he was the first Black man to own a small little bank. I said, he's coming to talk to me. Well, no, he was coming to talk to the white kids to reassure them that the world was not going to blow up just because 300 cities were burning. And in that whole time period, he would ask questions, and I would raise my hand. My hand would be just, you know, I'm a talker, as you can see, anyway. And and I'd be like, talk. I'd be raising my hand. I know that, you know, I know that, you know, I know who Bobby Seale is. I know that, you know. And he would like look around the room, ignore me and stuff like that. And I knew him too from social gatherings, you know. And it's like, oh, years later I understood, no. Everybody white in America thought we were on the verge of revolution, and we were. So he wasn't actually coming to say, you know, this is like the chicken's coming home to roost. He was coming to say, it's going to be okay, white kids, go home and tell your parents, you know. And I then went into seventh grade just full of rage. I just started having fistfights a lot, you know. And so they kicked me out, so.
Yeah, and really kind of thinking about, you know, how you negotiated that at the time, and then kind of, you know, in hindsight, kind of seeing the ways in which it shaped you. But kind of double tapping on your parents, you know, what are some of the most important lessons they taught you, even if it was just in the way in which they lived and showed up in the world?
That's a hard one. We were at loggerheads a lot because by the time I became a teenager, I didn't like the way they responded to this. Okay.
And what's this?
Anti-Black racism, aggressivity, the neighbors. Okay.
Okay.
You know, they were very different. You know, my mom was like calm, cool, and collected. And then all of a sudden, at some moment, she'd just explode on people. The point is that she hadn't, in my view, hadn't built up an analysis for that explosion. And my dad was primarily always not reserved, but rational. His whole approach to this was rational. And as I said at the beginning of this conversation, as I intimated, this is the most anti-Black racism is the most irrational dynamic in the world. It's not based on sense making. It's based on fantasy and projection. You cannot actually educate the unconscious. Why? Because education works through secondary processes of signification, and primary processes of signification are really allergic to logic. That's why we have poetry, which is called in psychoanalysis called facilitation, where you bring secondary process signification together with primary process signification and produce something new that draws from both realms of the psyche. But the realm of the psyche that solidifies and secures anti-Blackness is primarily in the unconscious. The realm of the psyche that solidifies and secures anti-Latinoness is secured primarily in the preconscious. In other words, it is saying you have broken a lot of rules in LA by coming across the border to San Diego. You've broken a lot of rules by doing this, that, and the other. The unconscious doesn't say that to Black people. So in other words, I felt that my parents tried to respond to the most irrational dynamic with a rational response. When an AK-47 would have been a whole lot better, okay? Just kidding, FBI. So what I'm really trying to say is, who knows what would have been better? Because the world is against us, not aspects of the world. And that's why the end of the world is the only thing that will produce a new dynamic. And so I then had to think to myself, you know, well, how do I want to be? You know, I don't, these rational interventions against anti-Black racism feed our frustration. They do not produce a productive response. How do I know that? Because I was born in Emmett Till. I lived through civil rights. I participated in Black Power. I lived through the smashing of it. And I lived through the whole new thing in the 90s of post-racialism and everything. What I saw was that there are glimmers in which it's easier to live as a Black person, and then all of a sudden the world comes in and smashes it and makes it harder than it was 10 years before. But later I softened towards them in understanding that they understood what they were not necessarily acting on. That the violence that comes from resistance of any kind is exponentially greater than the dynamic would allow for. If you ask for a piece of bread, they will lynch you. So in other words, they had a trauma built in from the past, from years in Louisiana, that informed a need to be cautious. This is my analysis. And so I understood that, and I'm compassionate about that. What I don't agree with is a sense that America can be improved through logical conversation and rational dialogue with the other. No, America is a murderous juggernaut. Its job is to murder. Okay, that's what it's about. That's its reason for being. It has killed more people around the world than Hitler, Genghis Khan, and Attila the Hun put together. Okay, that's what it does. Okay, that's how it gets its energy. Okay, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. So I decided that I had to move in the world in a way that would ultimately bring me more aggro, but make me feel better about myself in the way I move through the world, number one. And number two, when I spoke, even if I'm speaking to a class or a mixed race audience, I'm not really speaking to them. I'm only speaking to Black people. In other words, everyone else in the room is just listening. Everyone else, anyone who's reading this book is not Black, is just listening. And how do I get to that? By bringing the funk with the energy that allows for Black people to say, I support the Palestinians against the Israelis, but I also laugh at the Palestinians and ridicule the puniness of their demand in comparison to the totality of my demand, my embodied demand. Okay, and so ridicule, humor, sarcasm, and no sacred cows has been how I've tried to live.
I'm gonna zero in on that Palestinian thing, because I could feel a future hair stand up on somebody's head when they hear that. And so I think it begs to maybe unpack that, right? Which is to say that the demand that the Palestinians have, there is an actual reparation for, which is just geography, right? Meaning that it is just a return to land, and then there is equilibrium, right? Like that is the, the denouement and the restitution after the conflict, right?
Yeah.
And what you posit in the book and kind of in this theory writ large is that there is no reparation for Black people, right? There is no land that can be returned, even if we're speaking about class struggles, right? Like that is a restitution or access to capital, right? Which then resolves the conflict. Even when it pertains to gender studies, it is what some level of social equilibrium, right? I can be a CEO now of a Fortune 500 company as a white woman and get respect. There is a thing to actually aim towards, which makes
Yes.
it because it is something that is tangible. It may be withheld, but it is still tangible. And what the Black individual is reaching for, or what would repair them, is actually like ontologically denied them from birth.
Yeah.
And so it's a void that can actually never be refilled without the complete annihilation of the system writ large, because it is baked within it. And we speak about this actually in our second podcast episode with Mabel Wilson, who's an architect,
Oh,
and how she frames it is through the lens of design and the ways in which design has been leveraged to reify Blackness over and over and over again. So it's actually the design of the slave ship, right? The actual architecture, the built environment of the slave ship that made what were native peoples, right, to a continent, slaves, right? So it actually, design is actually what made them slaves. And then it is design that continues to make you slaves over and over again, right? Because every time a Black person reaches a horizon of humanity, it is design that is actually leveraged, right? The design of a penitentiary, the design of public housing, the design of corporate structures, legalese, all of these systems that remove you once again from like the citizenry. So that's just another frame through which to, kind of understand that. But kind of thinking about, I mean, bro, like I said, I'm like 2/3 of the book, and I'm like, I mean, obviously this guy would arrive at afro-pessimism. Like, come on, like you integrate this neighborhood, and you have neighbors antagonizing you as a preteen. You get kicked out of Dartmouth for organizing a protest just so that the workers can eat in public sight, because the white students were complaining that seeing them eat was like giving them indigestion.
oh,
And for you to lead this charge, you get kicked out, right? Like that's the beyond logic, right? Like that's the way in which rationality of reason
yeah.
can never get to the thing. And even as you wanted to and tried to find a common, and these are white workers, like these are not other Black folks, you know what I mean? You know what I mean? And so, and even in that level of kind of like courage and rebellion,
Yeah.
like the system rejects you. They say like, no, right? Like this is not a part of it. To then even, being traced and followed by like the FBI as a teenager, them following you to Trinidad when you're going there to do research, and coming up against this kind of like redacted file, showing up in your studio to find that it's been changed from the inside, and there are people inside going through your shit, and then you see them come out of the window and you chase them down the street. So I'm going through all of this because, one, people need to read the book because it's fascinating. But really kind of getting to this place of, you have an empirical lived experience, really, like really, of the way in which the state and America writ large continues to show up in real time and tell you exactly who they are. But as you also said before, that like this is actually relational. This is actually not about this is not situational, it's actually relational. And in a prior episode with David Zilber, who is a chef, and he was head of the fermentology fermentation lab at Noma, which is like the #1 restaurant in the world, we spoke about recipes, right? And the ways in which recipes are actually relational, right? They're relationships to the ingredients. And so what slavery really is, or this kind of dynamic, is a recipe that is relational, so that even though the ingredients can change, the relationship stays the same. That's how it works. But I say all of that to say, or to get to, we're of different generations, and I love cross-generational conversations. But what I feel is your experiences I have not experienced. And so we are a generation, and even those who are younger than me are a generation who sometimes even trust the FBI, right?
I'm not laughing at you. You just caught me by surprise. Okay, yeah.
But right? Like,
yeah.
Someone gets murdered and the cops, fumble everything. And then the Black folks say, oh, now there's going to be an FBI investigation, as if that's going to bring about a different outcome. And so how do you view contemporary Black life as it relates to the life that you have empirically lived, right? And how should we be thinking and moving about the world, right? Because the ways in which these systems of oppression work is that they just shift the ways in which they oppress. They hide it. It's couched in technology.
Yes. Can you hold that question? Remember, I want to say something about something you said before, and then I come back.
Yeah. Hit it.
The funny, my book, Afro-Pessimism, I had to cut out almost 40,000 words before it went to press because of the contract size. And if you have a book that's over 110,000 words, people in the rest of the world tend not to want to buy it to translate. So it was my contract was 110. But one thing I couldn't write about that thing at Dartmouth was that you got this Nelson Rockefeller's son or nephew writing a letter to the dean saying that the workers give me and the boys in Beta House, my frat, indigestion. And then the dean tells the head of food services to remove the workers and not let them take their tray. There are 4 gigantic dining rooms in this very old building, and they have to go to a certain place at certain times, when before, they just, as long as I was there, 74 to this moment in March of 78, I've just been sitting at tables and they've been at the other table or whatever, now they get this order that they got to go somewhere else. Okay. These are, as I said in the book, these are the same people who, if I go 5 miles out of town in Hanover, they call me the N-word. They got their cars on cinder blocks. They're Appalachian Trail white people. I'm not Afro-pessimist. Afro-pessimism doesn't exist in 1978. I'm a dyed-in-the-wool Maoist and an existentialist. And I'm like, God damn it, this is for the working class. I'm trying to we had this big fight of 300 Black people in the basement of the Black House. Should we do this? Should we not do this? And we finally decide we're going to do something. We're not going to have a mass rally, but we're going to go one by one to where they sit. All right. So I get arrested because I went to sit with them. But the entire arrest ordeal takes about 45 minutes that I won't go into. And these cats are like sitting at the table, just munching away, docilely, quietly, watching. I don't mean with glee like a Southern segregationist. I don't mean with anger like a revolutionary. I mean they're just munching away quietly at the table they've been sent to and watching the spectacle of me and this other cat being arrested. And in my mind I'm thinking, well, goddamn, I thought we had solidarity with the working class. So it was a very, very surreal kind of experience. And some of them I worked with in across the street. I was a banquet caterer for my work-study job, and I wish I could put that in a book because it was more surreal than you could imagine, And I remember thinking to myself, if it was March, I was a month away from becoming 22 years old, and I remember thinking, aren't y'all gonna do something? We did something for you. Aren't y'all gonna stand up? I just got taken down to the courthouse. You know? Okay, so now so I want to say, to circle back to your question, what did you say?
Oh, just with the life that you've lived, right, where you have a real lived, tangible experience of the power of the state and the machinations of like the
Mm.
American system. There's a new generation of Black individuals who don't have that direct, right? Outside of like the kind of the spectacle of Black Death with the killing of George Floyd and Trayvon Martin, right? But we haven't had like FBI people following us, at least to our knowledge, right? Like we haven't
Yeah.
had, been locked out of our apartments because there are people inside, investigating us. And so like what should we be thinking about, right? Like, has the world changed or has it shifted,
Yeah.
right? Because now we're in a place where, I don't know, police officers are getting convicted.
Yeah. Well, they aren't, as you know. And you know, here's what I would say. I was not an autodidact in that way. I mean, if I marked 68 as this turning point, but I also mark 67 when I was 11, and all I wanted was become a priest. So, and there's a way in which what's your zodiac sign?
Scorpio.
Oh, I'm glad we're on Zoom, Jack.
Oh,
I'm joking.
says the Aries.
Yes, I know that. Yeah, there's a way in which Aries are these passionate fanatics, and 1 minute they'll be fascists, and the next minute they'll be communists, but with the same passion as and see no contradiction. My point is that I went from a devout Roman Catholic to a communist in 12 months, but it wasn't because I saw something. It was because people told me something.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what the state and civil society has crushed is the context in which Black revolutionaries can educate Black kids. That's that's the context I grew up in. I can't. I mean, if you can imagine, by the time Reagan left office at the end of the 80s, there was something like 35 underground newspapers in the country. And I'm gonna look at my bookshelf to see if I brought it here, if I put it somewhere else. No, I don't have it. But but when he came to office, right, there were something like 635 underground publications. So think about that.
Mm-hmm.
You could get a critique of the state anywhere you went. There was Ramparts magazine, there was the Berkeley Barb, there were little things being produced in the Midwest. People were coming to my parents' house to have meetings and leaving these tracts, and they did not ask the question, how do we improve the conditions of the United States of America? They asked other questions. How do we ignite the spirit of Che Guevara, who said 1, 2, 3, many M-I-N-I, 1, 2, 3, many Vietnams? How do we reproduce the spirit of Patrice Lumumba? How do we destroy this system? How do we understand it systemically? Not how do we understand it performatively? And so the scale of abstraction that I was exposed to at the age of 12 was a very high scale of abstraction, because that's what teenagers and college kids were talking on that level. They were talking on that level, okay? And so it's not true that every 10 years or every 20 years, intellect improves. No, I mean, anyone will tell you that the 18th century was the century of enlightenment, and the 19th century is like everybody lost their mind and went dumb again, So what I'm trying to say is that I could just go to places where there'd be rap sessions. I went to high school when I got kicked out of the Kenwood area. I went to I traveled the country with my parents for all of eighth grade, and in Detroit, months after the Algiers motel incident and the rebellion there, in Chicago for the murder of Fred Hampton, in Berkeley for a year after People's Park and for the dust up over Cambodia at UC Berkeley. And these people were coming to the junior high school and kicking the teachers out. Weather
Mm,
Underground, Weather Underground, SDS, Panthers, kicking teachers out and saying, now we're commandeering this space for anti-imperialist teachings. Okay, so in other words, what I'm trying to say is that I was raised to respect the law. I was raised to think like Martin Luther King, like the moral quality of an individual. But something happened and the world changed, and I got a new perspective of how to. So I look at the world structurally now. I don't look at the world performatively, but I didn't come to that on my own.
mm, mm. No, that's super powerful. Hopefully, even this space, right, is a space for that wisdom and knowledge and experience to be translated and transformed. I'm going to pivot a little bit and also want to be respectful of your time. Do you have just a few more
I
minutes?
do, and I want to say that I do. I have 20 more minutes.
Okay,
I,
perfect.
I want to say that I find it very interesting. I want you to send me an email, if you would, of the person who was the architect that talked about design, so I can, because what it reminded me of, my parents did work for Lyndon Baines Johnson, um, going to the Soviet Union and trying to end the Cold War with educators going over here and coming over here, going over there and coming over here. But Johnson was actually trying to end poverty, right? With the war against poverty. And here's how anti-blackness is in the core of every little, even the most liberal gesture. He then decided, let's build a ton of public housing units around the country, and he got prison architects to design public housing in the urban area. So yes, I see what that person was saying very clearly and historically.
Okay, so I'm gonna do a slight tangent too, because so I mean the world that the lens through which I look at the world is actually through the lens of design, right? Design for me gets at the fundamental um, machinations, right? So what you say even about having um, prison architects build public housing is not far from what actually undergirds this country, right? So Thomas Jefferson has this and had this incredible fascination with the design of prisons, the architecture of prisons, right? The panopticon. And the same architect that, well, finished building the Capitol, right, in Washington, D.C. Do you know what he built right before that?
No.
Virginia State Penitentiary. And so before we actually even had a body, right, an actual physical place in which to enact laws, we actually already have built the prison, right?
Yeah.
And so that is actually a through line, actually, and it's not some kind of like tangential like phenomenon, right? It actually is embedded in the structure, the actual built environment structure of this country. And also in that episode, we speak about one of those housing projects, which is in my hometown of St. Louis, Pruitt-Igoe, which was destroyed on national television. And the same architect, Yamasaki, I believe, is actually the same guy who built the Twin Towers, which was also destroyed on national television. So I was like, if he ever built me a doghouse, I'm not going in it.
I hear you.
But I want to kind of pivot to just even your process, like I've listened and did a lot of research, particularly with just even your talks, particularly with DS Marriott, David Marriott, who is phenomenal.
Yeah.
And you said something about taking like you had been traveling a lot, and you mentioned it off the cuff. And you said, so I haven't been able to do a lot of deep reading.
Yeah.
What is deep reading, and what is your process of deep reading?
Well, I have different kind of periods. So um, when we get to around November, I'm coming off of a medical leave for cancer, which started in January, and officially I'm off of it in now, and I'll be starting back. So I will be doing administrative work, and I won't be teaching in the fall. But we are on a quarter system, so in this winter I'll be teaching. I think it's a course. I know it's a course on psychoanalysis for grad students, and it's their methodology course in psychoanalysis, and then an undergrad course on Fanon. So that means that I'll go to you see these shelves one, two, the third shelf down.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, these are books I haven't touched. I've read all these books, but I haven't touched them in almost a year.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we've got an Encyclopedia of Psychoanalysis, Lacan's Ecrit, David Marriott's work, the work of Kaja Silverman, White Psychoanalytic Feminism, works of Frantz Fanon, Jared Sexton's work, and then along the top here are these kind of for beginners type books on Nietzsche, Freud, Lacan, et cetera, et cetera. So I have to go back into that. Now I'm not going to go into that and prepare. And I felt that if you want to have a conversation, if I want to have a conversation with David Marriott, it wasn't true, because it was what I'm about to say is not true, but this is what I felt. If I want to have a conversation with David Marriott, I got to get back to reading all that stuff before I can talk to him. Fortunately, we were talking about his poetry, and also I happen to know a lot more than I think I know at the moment of anxiety before a podcast. Okay, but right now, I'm trying to mobilize what's called the language of facilitation, which is to bring together the kind of primary process of signification, images, simile, that kind of thing, metaphor, metonymy, simile. Those are the aspects that come under the category of facilitation, because they bring together the signifying processes of secondary processes of the preconscious and the unconscious. And that's what literature is all about. And I'm trying to write a novel, and what I want the novel to do primarily, not totally, but primarily, is to evoke a kind of passion, whether it's joy or sadness. It's not pure irrational, but that's where it's weighted. Whereas when I'm teaching psychoanalysis, what I want to do is provoke a kind of analysis. And so now what I'm doing is I'm reading about the historical time period of which the novel takes place, which is 68 to 72. I'm also reading poetry so that I kind of remember how that works. I'm rereading my own creative work, and I'm rereading and reading fiction. So I'm doing a deep reading in stuff that is not theoretical, but it's kind of mobilizing, so that, because I had to build a world in fiction. With my courses, I have to critique a world that exists. So I'm not reading theory much now. And that's why I was a little uptight being with David Marriott.
Well, and also trying to, because I feel like, we live in a world of like social media and kind of like endless distraction, but like, what does it mean to like deeply read, right? Like, do you really set aside days and time, and what is that?
Well, I know what you mean
for yourself. Yeah. Are you underlining, going back, writing about it in your journal, so it processes, sinks into your mind? Like, how do we dive into like Fanon, and even Marriott, and make sure that we really walk away with the info? You know what I mean?
Okay. Well, one of the things is I'm fortunate. I am fortunate in that I don't subscribe to television. I do have Netflix and Topic and MHZ, and but I get guilty when I if I binge anything, or if I can feel the next day that, you know what, Frank, 7 to 10 at night, you should have been reading. You should have been reading. What were you doing? Were you watching something? Now the nice thing is that I don't channel flip because I don't have channels, but I do sometimes know that I go somewhere. That's my primary process of signification, saying you'll have a lot more fun if you sit down and watch a series and just chill out.
Mm-hmm.
And the next day, secondary process of signification, say, dude, you didn't get 1,000 words done yesterday, and you didn't read this book on the Red Scare, and how it happened, and for your character, whatever. So I do a lot of underlining. I also do a lot of journaling, and so I have. So there are journals for quotes,
Mm.
and images in the creative process, and in the critical process, there are what I'm trying to do when I journal and say copy something down from a passage from a book. I'm trying to figure out. I'm rewriting something in the journal that informs my analytic apparatus, so that I'm interested in paradigm. In other words,
Mm-hmm.
I'm interested in what someone is and where they land prior to their actions. So by that I mean that when you're born, the mother is pregnant and they do an ultrasound, depending upon what the ultrasound shows, the genitals on the ultrasound then produce value into the world of the parents. And that value is differentiated along an artificial axis, but is treated as real, called gender. And then they go home and they paint the room blue, or look for Johnny, Jim, or whatever, and paint the room pink and look for Jane or Maria. And so what does that mean? It means that there's a fetus here, but an entire context a paradigm has been produced to exceed, because it's like the ocean for a fish, and anticipate the coming of that fetus. The fetus doesn't come and say, "Oh, Jack, you know what I like to be?" And so when I'm reading critical theory, I'm reading for ways in which someone does or does not understand that. I mean, in other words, a lot of the miseducation of an Anglo-American is very different than the miseducation of a continental European, or the miseducation of a South African, places where I've taught. The miseducation of an Anglo-American is that the Anglo-American is heavily burdened with empiricism and observation as being values in themselves. And so the Anglo-American hits set after school, highly deficient in terms of a capacity to think abstractly compared to other people, because since Matthew Arnold's time, education has been about what do you see, what do you say, who do you think you are, what is your experience, And so Americans really cannot think systemically, cannot think paradigmatically. In fact, we're encouraged not to. We're told that we can do anything and be anyone we want, and that our voice and our observations are what's most important. And so when I'm reading, I'm trying to figure out, even in someone who disagrees with me, there's going to be a point in the passage where in the text where they hit upon where I can symptomatically understand what they think about paradigm, even if
Mm-hmm.
they don't talk about paradigm.
Mm-hmm.
And that circles us back to our starting point, because that's what we did with Afropessimism. We actually critiqued the psychoanalytic foundation of feminism and the Marxist foundation of social movements, to say, what do they assume to be true about paradigm? Because what they assume to be true about paradigm is inadequate to thinking Black suffering.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I have two more questions,
Okay.
and then we are out. Obviously, I think you're gonna have to come back because I feel like we didn't even. If you saw my list of questions, I touched three. Um,
Okay.
but this one is a little bit, interesting. Um, you mentioned your wife Anita, who actually this is dedicated to, who is actually not Black. And
Yeah.
so how in this world of Afro-pessimism and understanding these kind of paradigmatic frames, and scenes that we find ourselves in, how does one reconcile having a romantic partner who is a human?
I don't think that that's an easy question. Uh,
Yeah.
I, uh, you know, one of the things we have to so I can go off on tangents. I'll try and cut to the chase. Um, I think if I'm going to sound glib, but and by sounding glib, I may sound as though I figured it out from day to day performatively, which I have not. However, the glib response, then we can work back through it, is that there is no reconciling.
Mm,
Um, once you, and I don't want to say that I'm better than other people who hammer their heads against the wall, trying to reconcile. Um, but if this is a problem of paradigmatic proportions,
mm-hmm,
then it will not be reconciled through interpersonal dynamics.
mm-hmm.
The paradigmatic, the paradigmatic proportions will erupt in interpersonal dynamics. you know, but to say that they'll be reconciled would be to say that I can step outside of who I am and step outside of the paradigm prior
Mm,
to a revolution that destroys the paradigm and deal with this love affair.
mm,
So I would say that I have not seen the play called Slave Play, but I've heard about it, and I think it's what I've heard. I have two thoughts, and I want your listeners and viewers to know these are highly provisional, because I'm ordering the book. It was part it came here about a year ago, but the pandemic was such that I didn't want to go, to see it. So my first thought is I think is from what I've heard, I think it's a work of pure genius. My other thought is that those characters are and are not me and my wife.
mm,
In other words, we have to understand that characters are scaled down projections of what the writer needs for the argument that the writer is making.
mm-hmm,
And there's a film that I teach a lot called Mandalay by Lars von Trier. And at the end of and what I'm trying to say here is that there is a space for people who are human and people who are Black talking about the impossibility of the kind of reconciling that you talked about, that you asked about, and moving on without reconciling it,
mm,
but making that a part of their daily, weekly, whatever dynamic. Okay. And I think that's all we can actually hope for. On the other end of the spectrum is Afrocentrism, which says cleanse your mind, have only a Black partner, and cure the dynamics of anti-Blackness in that way. Well, David Marriott and Fanon showed us, even though he's queasy about it in Black Skin, White Mask, but that, you know what? Um, Anti-Blackness is not outside there. It's inside here and
mm,
outside there.
mm,
So, and so to suggest that I'm going to reconcile the problem by producing Black babies, by having a Black partner, by buying Black, by living Black, um, is to suggest that I have powers beyond what my psyche is motivating me towards, and I can actually live in another world.
Mm.
I can live in another world without having a violent revolution of any kind. I can just live
Hmm.
in another world and make my other way. And that is problematic because you're never more populated by your own anti-Black thoughts than you are when you're by yourself just waking up in the morning.
That.
So we have to think of this as a struggle and
Hmm.
put the word protracted on the part of it, but it doesn't mean the other side either. It doesn't mean that I can have interracial love affairs as though this as though one person is a slave and one person is not a master. As though there's no master, as though the master slave dynamic doesn't exist. That's
Hmm.
the integrationist view, you know.
Hmm.
And both
Hmm.
those views, the integrationist view and the Afrocentrist view, are being motivated. If you do a rhetorical analysis of their language and their texts, they're actually being driven by their understanding and kind of grasping of secondary processes of signification. In other words, they very seldom have anything to say about the unconscious and what
Hmm.
that means. And so, and that's what makes the psychoanalytic part of this so scary, because it's not the white world just responding against you. It's like David Marriott says, my imago, my image in the mirror, is something that my unconscious tells me to garrison myself against and to fight against at the same time.
Mm.
Even as my preconscious interest says, hate all whiteys, you know? Um, so it's really to suggest, and I have people who have absolute problems. I mean, people who say, uh, people who do not engage in the psychoanalytic or psychic aspects of Afropessimism. And they sometimes write me and say, oh, you have a white lover. I'm going to burn your book. So I'm not going to, so in other words, they don't understand that this book here is a critique. It is not a manifesto. It will not help you live your life. It
Mm.
will help you understand your life and give you more problems understanding it than you thought you had. And then you must do the rest.
That is a beautiful place to wrap, man. Before I ask my last question, I just want to acknowledge you, Frank, for putting this to paper, right? Like giving us a vocabulary to our lived experience. I can't remember. I think it's Wittgenstein who speaks about the ways in which our reality is limited by the language we have to which
Yes.
to address it, right? And so what you've done is provided just a canon of vocabulary and understanding to help us see, right? To help us see those invisible paradigms and images that we are constantly trying to fight against, even through, right, being traced by, being tracked by the FBI, or like having radioactive material dropped on you, like from a ceiling above. I mean, like the stories are crazy. Like, guys, please go get Afro-pessimism, so you can get into this. But I know that that's not easy, and I know, even I'm sure, a part of your personal relationship, right, with your wife is a part of the practice as well. And without you, man, like we wouldn't be able to see any clearer. Like, and even the secondary level of Afro-pessimism that you speak about, like, could not exist without this foundational work, and also without the relationships that you've built, across, right, to help inform it. And so I just want to acknowledge and thank you so much for that. You've helped me even see the things that I couldn't see, and I'm out here really trying to see shit.
Yeah.
But the last question is, man, like, if you had everything at your behest, right?
Yeah.
What is the world that you imagine for the future? Maybe there is afro-optimism, but what is the world you imagine for the future?
I would like, I'm sorry to disappoint you. I don't think that too much. Not that I shouldn't. I just, I don't.
Mm,
There are two reasons for that. The first reason is that sometimes, I had to rewrite this book 8 times, and it was not always joyous. Sometimes rehashing the material is, this is pleasurable because I'm meeting a Black intellectual who's of another generation, and Kanikwa is here, and we're having this conversation, and I'm feeling something, a connection. But normally I feel isolation,
mm,
and normally I feel uh, it's getting better all the time, with more and more people. But oftentimes, one of the things I understand is that Black as slave is an empirical, it's part of the episteme that produced the modern world. And so for me to project beyond that would be for me to have the hubris to say that I have a language and a vision beyond the words and the tools that I have now. And I do not have that.
mm,
What I do have is an understanding that this does not always exist, and there can be an epistemological break, a catastrophe that brings us to a new episteme. But I can't say what that looks like. Sorry, from the oh, sorry, this is an alarm, and okay, and then so I would be a fantasist, having
mm,
written what I said, having written what I've written, and understood what I've understood about knowledge production, and where I think that Black is the word that doesn't actually travel. It doesn't have endless forms of commutability. In other words, like all words, according to semiotics and psychoanalysis, can change their value based upon how they're used. And one of the things that Patterson has helped us understand is that slave doesn't change its value. That slave is the necessary entity outside of the world of people whose value can change.
mm.
So that's really interesting to me. Could there be a world in which there are no slaves, psychically or empirically? I'm not so sure about that. Can there be a world where Blackness and slaveness are not the same? Yes. Can we ever get there? I don't know. Okay. And so then, what was the? Because I had another thing to say. The question was, how do I?
Yeah, what's the world you imagine for the future? Is there like an
Okay,
afro-optimism?
no, but it doesn't mean that. But pessimism is a clinical word here. It's
Mm,
pessimism. It's not an emotional word. It's stolen from Antonio Gramsci, who in his prison notebooks wrote that what I'm working on here is a pessimism of the intellect, which is to say, a pessimism of the way thought has been thought. That's what we've been doing. We're pessimistic about the way thinking about liberation has been thought, but we're optimistic. But he says, I have optimism of the will, which is the optimism of the working class in Milan to commandeer the factories or the Soviets to have a revolution. I have a profound optimism in Black struggle.
mm,
Uh, I think that that's one of the reasons why everyone wants and does not want Black people in their coalitions, because Black people will give you an energy that's beyond language, uh, uh, because we are if we're dealing with something like police brutality in Oakland, and we bring Blackness into that, we're actually saying we're against police brutality with our Samoan and Chicana brothers and sisters. But what we're moving towards is not the end of police brutality. We're energized towards the idea of the end of the police, which is a very different kind of way of being in the body than the junior partners have. They genuinely want access to civil society. We genuinely understand, we want it, but we understand that we can never have it. And so we're motivated by something larger, and it's that largeness of energy. You can't have a revolution without Blackness. Everyone knows this. Everyone also knows that once we get our shit, we don't want Black people anywhere around because they're continuing the struggle in a way that we want to consolidate power. Basically, as I said before, I'm 66, going on 67. And what I really want is to get through all this without getting killed and then live somewhere in the Mediterranean and say I did my bit.
You know what, bro? When you spoke about, like, that there could be no revolution without Blackness, and what Black people bring is beyond language. For me, that is the Black imagination.
Yes, it is.
That is the fuel, right? Like, that is the kind of largesse of possibility that is addictive. But anyway, Frank, this has been an absolute fucking pleasure, man. I cannot wait to have another conversation really, 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 really soon. Have an incredible afternoon, and thank you for sharing it.
Whew. All right, we made it. 2 episodes on Afropessimism with Frank B. Wilderson III. How are you feeling? Let us know your thoughts over on Instagram and Twitter at Black Imagination. And be sure to check out this conversation and others at blackimagination.com, or you can also watch it over on YouTube at the Institute of Black Imagination. This conversation reminds me of a quote from the Reverend James Forbes of Riverside Church when he says, "What do you do with the rage within? You go build a city." Stay curious and keep dreaming.